Welcome to this new Last Records video. I'm Patrick, and one thing about me, I love to eat. But in this episode, I'm diving into the worst food-related deaths that genuinely made me question that hobby. From a man who swallowed a live centipede to a woman who cooked a toxic backyard frog for an anti-aging recipe, which ended in the most tragic way possible. It was July 18th, 2019, at a market by the sea in Japan. It was the middle of the day. The sun was bright and the air smelled of salt and fish. The market ran along the waterfront. The stalls were close together. The ground was wet from melting ice. Vendors called out to the people walking past. Most of the stalls sold seafood. Kenji Sato, 44, worked as a purchasing manager in Osaka. He had driven to the coast for the weekend with no real plan. He had eaten seafood his whole life and was completely comfortable with it. He had tried most things that came from the water. He was not the kind of person who hesitated at a food stall or asked a lot of questions before trying something new. Being confident at a market like this was normal for him. It was just how he was. I want to be clear here. Kenji wasn't reckless. He wasn't showing off. He was a man at a seafood market doing what he had always done. That distinction matters. He had eaten jellyfish before, more than once. The kind sold at restaurants and markets, sliced thin, salted, dried until firm, sometimes seasoned. He knew what it looked like and what it tasted like. Partway through the market, he passed a stall selling jellyfish in its usual form, already sliced and packed. He looked at it and kept walking. A little further along, another vendor had something different. It was a large, fresh Nomura's jellyfish, one of the biggest jellyfish species in the world, laid out whole on a wide surface. It was large and pale, with thick tissue and a soft, see-through look. The vendor was offering to cut pieces from it for anyone who wanted to buy. A few people had stopped to look at it. Kenji looked at it and saw jellyfish, a fresher version, less processed, closer to its natural state. In his experience, fresher usually meant better when it came to seafood. He paid and waited while the vendor cut him a piece. What he did not know, and what had not seemed worth thinking about, was that the way jellyfish is prepared before eating is not just about taste or texture. It serves a real purpose. Jellyfish flesh contains nematocysts, tiny stinging structures that sit inside the tissue, including in parts that look like ordinary meat. In a live jellyfish, these structures fire when touched and push venom into whatever they contact. They can still fire after the jellyfish has died, especially when pressed or disturbed. While being stung by this species on normal skin is not usually life-threatening, the inside of the mouth and throat is a very different matter. Salting, drying, and extended preparation breaks these structures down over time and greatly reduces their ability to fire. Fresh tissue goes through none of that process. The nematocysts in a freshly cut piece of Nomura's jellyfish are mostly still whole and still active. I actually spent 3 hours researching nematocysts specifically for this case, and what I found genuinely shocked me. The structures are essentially biological syringes. Pressure activates them, and chewing is pressure. He ate the piece standing at the stall. The reaction started while he was still chewing. Chewing put pressure on the tissue and mixed it with saliva. Together, the pressure and the contact with saliva provided exactly the kind of physical and chemical triggers that caused nematocysts to fire. They fired throughout his mouth, all at once. The stinging hit his tongue, the inside of his cheeks, the roof of his mouth, and the back of his throat as he swallowed. It was not one sting in one spot. It was a large number of stings firing at the same time across soft tissue that is full of blood vessels and reacts fast to any injury with swelling. And this is where it starts to get deeply uncomfortable. The pain came first, sharp and immediate. Then a burning feeling moved down into his throat. Swallowing became difficult almost straight away. Within a few minutes, his lips began to swell. Then his tongue. His throat started to tighten. The venom entering through the soft tissue of the mouth and throat was causing swelling throughout the upper airway. His breathing became difficult. The airway was getting narrower as the swelling grew. He collapsed at the market. People nearby called for help. Emergency responders arrived to find serious swelling in his upper airway and breathing that was in a critical state. He was taken to the hospital. Despite efforts to help him, the swelling in his airway grew faster than doctors could bring it under control. He died from a blocked airway caused by severe internal stinging, most likely made worse by a severe allergic response consistent with anaphylaxis. The investigation confirmed that the piece he had eaten was not processed and still contained active stinging cells. The vendor, when questioned, said he had assumed the man knew what he was buying and understood that it needed to be prepared before eating. The man had seemed confident. He had not asked any questions. This genuinely made me question whether confidence and experience actually matter once a line has already been crossed. Now, the next story is harder to categorize. Kenji's case was a gap in knowledge no one could reasonably expect him to fill. James Reed's is different. Someone beside him hesitated, and before that hesitation could become a real objection, the moment had already taken shape. It was August 10th, 2018, in Hunan Province, China. The street market ran along a narrow lane between low buildings, stalls pressed close together. The smell of spice and smoke and unfamiliar cooking mixing in the heavy evening air. Vendors called out along both sides of the lane, and people moved slowly through the crowd, stopping to look at things they had never seen before. James Reed, 34, had worked without a real break for nearly 3 years. He was a project manager for a logistics firm in Manchester and had spent most of his 20s building a career that left little room for anything else. The trip to China was the first extended holiday he had taken since university. He had contacted an old university friend who had been living in Chengdu, and the two arranged to spend 2 weeks traveling through several provinces. And look, I understand that energy completely. You spend years promising yourself a trip, and when you finally take it, you want to do everything. You want to say yes to everything. That feeling is part of what makes this story so hard to read. His friend had become his guide to everything unfamiliar, what to eat, what to avoid, what was normal, and what was worth trying. James trusted his judgment because he had been there long enough to know the difference. They had spent several days working through market food, trying things James would never have considered at home, and nothing had gone wrong. The pattern of small, successful risks made the next one feel manageable. And this is the part that gets me, that pattern. Every small risk that goes well makes the next one feel smaller. That is just how human beings work. At some point during an earlier evening, his friend had mentioned, during a conversation, that giant centipedes were eaten in some parts of China. He added that he had seen them prepared and sold as food, usually cooked, and that people handled them without concern once they were no longer alive. He was less certain about anything beyond that. That lodged in James's mind and came back when they arrived at the Hunan market, and he saw the glass containers at the insect stall. The centipedes inside were alive. They moved slowly against the glass, dark and segmented, the largest nearly 8 inches long. The vendor began to reach for preparation tools when James gestured toward the container. The interaction shifted. James indicated he wanted one without preparation. The vendor hesitated, repeating a gesture and a short phrase indicating it should be cooked first. James repeated his own gesture. There was a brief exchange, the vendor looking between James and his friend before reluctantly complying. His friend hesitated, unsure if James was joking or trying to prove a point, and by the time he realized he was serious, he couldn't stop him. One was selected, thick-bodied, nearly 8 inches long and fully alive, and tried to swallow it in a single movement to avoid stopping halfway. I seriously wonder what James was thinking at this point, because what came next wasn't worth it. It did not go down cleanly. The legs caught against the back of his throat and triggered a violent gag reflex. The movement became uncontrolled almost immediately. It briefly obstructed the upper airway and triggered a severe reflex closure, preventing effective breathing. Even as it was forced lower, the irritation and repeated spasms made it impossible to draw a proper breath. He began to choke. His coordination deteriorated rapidly. He collapsed at the market stall. Emergency services were contacted, and James was transported for treatment. Despite medical intervention, his condition did not stabilize. He was pronounced dead later that evening. Medical findings indicated acute airway compromise caused by obstruction and reflex airway closure, with contributing irritation from the animal. His friend gave a statement to investigators that evening. He didn't finish his trip. I can't help but feel that if he had been more cautious, he might have made it past the second week and had the holiday he'd been waiting years for. Now, the next case is the one I personally find hardest to sit with out of every case in this video. Not because of what he did, but because of what he didn't research. It was the night of May 9th, 2020, at a campsite in the desert in Arizona. The fire had been going for a few hours. The group had eaten, had drinks, and the conversation had slowed into the kind of easy back and forth that happens late at a campfire when there is nothing left to plan. 31-year-old Caleb Turner worked in construction logistics in Phoenix and had grown up in the Southwest. He knew the desert and was comfortable in it. His friends said he was the type of person who checked things before acting, rather than acting without thinking. He had joined the desert camping for a weekend getaway with his friends. And look, I actually respect that quality in most situations. Checking before acting is more than a lot of people do. The problem here is what he checked and what he did not. Earlier in the evening, someone spotted a scorpion near the edge of the campsite. It was a large desert scorpion, thick-bodied, pale, the kind common in that part of Arizona. Likely an Arizona hairy scorpion. It moved slowly. Someone picked it up with a stick, and it sat on a flat rock near the fire while people looked at it. Someone made a comment that scorpions found in these deserts are good to eat. This is the part I struggle with, because I've been there. Around a campfire, the fire, the drinks, the dark, and someone says something that should sound ridiculous, but doesn't. He picked up his phone to look up if it was true. The connection was weak, the page loading slowly, but it was enough. What he found was general information. Most scorpions in North America are not considered medically dangerous to healthy adults. The descriptions were broad, not species specific, but they were enough to give him confidence. And this is where it starts to get deeply uncomfortable. What he did not look up, and what did not come to mind in that moment, was the other part of his medical history. Caleb had a known severe allergy to wasp stings, diagnosed when he was a child. So, he had carried an EpiPen for years because of it. The EpiPen was in the first aid kit in the truck, about 400 meters from where they were sitting. Venoms from different arthropods contain different proteins, but a person with a history of severe allergic reactions can be more prone to another venom triggering a similar response. He picked the scorpion up. It was alive and moving in his hand. He did not hesitate long. He put it in his mouth and bit down. As he bit down, the scorpion reflexively stung inside his mouth. Venom entered directly through the highly vascular soft tissue of his inner cheek and tongue, which allows rapid absorption. He spat part of the scorpion out. There was sharp pain. For a moment, he was not sure what he was feeling, but everyone laughed. Within minutes, his throat began to tighten. He said something about it to the people next to him. His breathing changed, shorter, harder to pull in. He was dizzy. He sat down, and then he could not stay sitting easily. His body was responding to the venom. His friends saw what was happening. They knew about his allergy. Someone ran toward the truck to get the EpiPen from the first aid kit. The campsite was not near a road. The truck was 400 meters away in the dark. Caleb's condition did not wait. By the time it was administered, the reaction had already progressed significantly, and it did not reverse the airway narrowing fast enough. Emergency responders had been dispatched as soon as they were called, but the site took time to reach. Paramedics arrived and began resuscitation on scene. Caleb Turner was pronounced dead after resuscitation efforts at the scene. Guess what? The scorpion was found nearby after it was alive. Caleb paid the price for a half-researched information, but the next person spent the most time researching, trying to be informed. And the gap between what she thought she knew and what was actually true is the part that I find hardest to sit with. It was August 22nd, 2019. In a residential neighborhood in Central Florida, the afternoon was heavy with heat, the kind that did not ease when the sun dropped lower. The vegetation in the backyard was dense, broad-leafed plants crowding the fence line, patches of shade that stayed damp through the evening. Nancy Owen, 29, worked part-time as a salon assistant and managed most of her time around her own interests. She read widely and without a clear structure, health forums, translated articles, blog posts that led to other blog posts. Over the past year, her focus had settled on natural anti-aging remedies, not the commercial kind, the older, stranger kind, preparations and treatments described in obscure corners of the internet that claimed results the mainstream market did not offer. And look, I am not here to dismiss the broader topic, but I feel that not all sources online are true, and one should stick to safety. Several weeks before August, she had begun working through material on frog-derived treatments. The topic was not new in the broader sense. Frog compounds had a long documented history in traditional medicine, but what she was reading sat at the edges of that history. Forum posts and translated summaries, often inconsistent with one another, describing certain frogs as having properties that improve skin quality, reduced visible aging, restored something the body had lost. The claims were vague and the images attached to them inconsistent. Different writers described different animals. The details shifted from one source to the next. What stayed consistent was one idea: that preparation made it safe, that the animal itself, properly handled and cooked, carried properties the body could absorb and use. She read this enough times, in enough different places, that it stopped feeling uncertain and started feeling like something established. And this is the part that gets me, because I just said it earlier. You do not believe something because one source tells you. You believe it because 10 sources repeat it, even if all 10 sources are wrong. There were frogs in her backyard. There always were in Florida. It was not something that required any particular conditions. That evening, she noticed one she had not seen before. It was large and slow-moving, sitting in the open near the base of the wall. The descriptions she had read mentioned larger frogs. This one was large. She did not consider the species further. She went and picked it up. What she was holding was a cane toad. Trust me, after looking up on this frog, frogs now scare me. Rhinella marina, one of the most established invasive species in Florida. Its parotid glands, 2 raised structures sitting behind the head, secret bufadienolides, a class of compounds that act on the heart by interfering with the sodium-potassium pump that helps regulate cardiac rhythm. They are not reliably neutralized by typical cooking temperatures, and exposure most often occurs during handling before heat is applied. The toxin is present on the surface of the animal and transfers readily through contact, contaminating the hands, the preparation area, and anything touched afterward. She brought it inside and began working in the kitchen. She had no verified method. What she had read described outcomes, not precise technique. She worked from general knowledge of how meat was prepared, applying the same logic. She handled the animal directly, turning it, applying pressure to position it. The parotid glands expressed toxin under that pressure. It spread across her hands and onto the surfaces she used. She did not recognize it as a hazard. The sensations did not immediately register as danger, only as something unfamiliar. The toxin had already transferred to her hands and from there to her mouth during preparation. And this is where it starts to get deeply uncomfortable. By the time heat was applied, the contamination was already present. At some point during cooking, she ate some of what she was preparing. More than a simple taste, enough to judge the result. The bitterness was immediate and intense, sharper than anything she expected. It did not resemble food. A burning sensation spread across her tongue and the inside of her cheeks, followed quickly by tingling and a sudden increase in saliva. Her stomach turned abruptly. She paused, but did not stop. The reaction felt extreme, but not yet clearly dangerous to her, something she interpreted as part of the process rather than a warning to abandon it. And this is the moment I find hardest to sit with, because that bitterness was the warning. That burning was the signal, and she interpreted it as part of the process. Within minutes, the nausea intensified sharply. A wave of dizziness followed, stronger than expected, forcing her to steady herself against the counter. Her heart no longer felt regular, not just fast, but uneven, in a way that was difficult to ignore. Her coordination began to fail. The bufadienolides were already in her bloodstream, interfering with the sodium-potassium pump that helps regulate cardiac rhythm. She moved away from the counter and tried to sit, but her balance was unreliable. Over the next half hour or so, her condition deteriorated rapidly. The irregular rhythm of her heart progressed into a severe arrhythmia. She attempted to stand at one point and could not maintain her footing. She collapsed inside the home. Her roommate found her unresponsive later that evening. Emergency services were contacted. Paramedics arrived in minutes. Despite resuscitation efforts, her condition did not stabilize. She was later pronounced dead. Medical findings were consistent with bufadienolide toxicity and cardiac arrest. The remains of the prepared animal were still in the kitchen. Examination later identified it as a cane toad. It did not correspond to any frog species used in documented culinary or medicinal practice. The sources she had been reading had not clearly identified one. And that's just the sad part of it. She was trying to take care of herself, and she was willing to take the risk. And then there is Graham Ellis. And I want to be upfront. When I first found this case, I almost did not believe it was real. Not because of what he ate, but because of how long it took. Because Graham Ellis felt completely fine for 18 hours until tragedy hits. It was October 15th, 2015. At a bush market in Limpopo Province, South Africa. The middle of the day. The sun was high and the air was hot and dry. The market sat along a dirt road between low trees and dry scrub. The stalls sold food, dried goods, traditional remedies, and animal parts used in cultural practices common to the area. Graham Ellis, 47, was from Leeds. He worked in property management and had been traveling through southern Africa with a small group for about 2 weeks. He was relaxed in unfamiliar places. When the group stopped somewhere, he usually moved ahead on his own. He liked to see what was further along. At this market, he walked down the stalls slowly, on his own, looking at things the rest of the group had not reached. And look, I actually think that quality is admirable. Most people in a tour group stay with the group. Graham was the one who went to see what was around the corner. That curiosity is part of who he was. At one stall, he stopped. Among the items laid out on the surface were vulture heads, dried, dark, the kind sold for use in traditional practices in parts of the region. He stood and looked at them for a while. He asked the vendor about one. The vendor spoke enough English to answer. It could be prepared. It would be roasted at the stall. Graham asked what it would cost. He negotiated the price and paid. And this is the part I find interesting. He negotiated the price. It felt like an experience. He waited while the vendor prepared it over a small open fire at the stall. When it was done, he took it and ate most of it, standing right there. He thought of it as something unusual, but safe enough. Something people here ate. Something that must be normal. Something he would remember. Vultures eat carcasses. That is what they are for. Their digestive systems are built to handle very high levels of bacteria and decay, levels that would cause serious illness in most other animals. But that ability belongs to their own bodies. It does not clean their tissue. The bacteria are not specific to vultures. They are found in soil and in decomposing organic matter. If tissue becomes contaminated and remains in conditions where oxygen is limited, especially if decay has already begun, the bacteria can produce botulinum toxin before the animal is cooked. Botulinum toxin is one of the most powerful neurotoxins in existence. The toxin can be destroyed by sufficient heat, but uneven cooking, especially over a small open fire, may not reliably reach all internal tissue. I spent a long time on this part of the research, and what I found is that the risk was not in the vulture itself. It was in the gap between what the fire could reach and what it could not. Graham ate tissue from the skull, the parts where heat reaches least reliably. He felt fine when he left. He found his group, and the rest of the afternoon passed without anything unusual. He ate dinner that evening. He went to sleep. For approximately 18 hours, nothing happened to him. Then the symptoms began. First, mild fatigue and blurred vision, easy to dismiss as tiredness from the heat and travel. Then double vision, and a dry mouth that water did not fix. Then difficulty swallowing, and speech that came out slow and slightly wrong. Then a growing weakness in his breathing, not sudden, but steady, as though the muscles involved were becoming less and less able to respond. His condition was consistent with progressive neuroparalysis. The toxin was moving through his bloodstream and blocking the connection between his nerves and his muscles, one group at a time. What gets me about that sequence is how easy it was to dismiss at the start. Fatigue, blurred vision, heat and travel. Every early symptom had a completely reasonable explanation. He was admitted to a hospital as his condition continued to worsen. Medical staff identified the pattern of symptoms as consistent with botulism. Supportive care was started. Advanced respiratory support, the kind needed to keep a person breathing while the toxin clears the body, was limited and took time to arrange. His condition did not stabilize. It continued to decline. Graham Ellis died from respiratory failure caused by neurotoxin exposure. He was 47 years old. His tour group filed a missing persons report after he failed to return the following day and could not be reached. He was located through the hospital. And the part that stays with me about Graham Ellis, the detail I cannot move past, is that his tour group filed a missing persons report they did not know. He had just walked a little further down the market than everyone else, and by the time they noticed he was gone, he was already in a hospital bed.